Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the last session of the day for our conference, Patriotic Populism. What does it offer democracy? Gaining power is one thing. Governing effectively is another. Can populist parties deliver on their promises in the face of deep institutional resistance? Is the Trump 2.0 strategy of institutional disruption viable in a European political context? Is the Trump 2.0 strategy of building a raft of supporters and voters from diverse backgrounds, is that a strategy that populist parties are looking at? Can populist parties govern without alienating others or becoming what they once opposed? These are interesting questions, and I'm glad to be joined with a great panel for our final session today. John McGurk is editor of Gripped, a really important magazine and newspaper in the Republic of Ireland. He's a commentator and he's a veteran of many Irish referendum campaigns. Alex Phillips is a TV talk show host, former Brexit Party MEP, and she does media strategy. Angeline Fouret is an MEP with the RN in France, an advocate for national sovereignty within the Patriots for Europe group. And finally, Jacob Reynolds is head of policy at MCC Brussels. I'll invite John to take the podium.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to start my remarks by apologising for being the person who interrupted Susanna during the last panel with the loudest and most boomer-friendly ringtone known to man. I'm sorry for that. It's a lesson, but there's always somebody. This time it was me. I'm also struck by in the last panel about how conservatism was just lambasted in favour of populism. And as a lifelong conservative, I think turnabout is fair play. Because this is a really, really important panel. Because we should start by asking, the question actually, as written down, I was given, was can populist parties wield power? The answer is, of course they can. Any idiot can wield power. The question we should be asking is, can populist parties wield power effectively? And I think the answer right now is no. And not just because I have looked at the stock markets around the world for the last week by the world's greatest populist deciding to wield power like a king or a monarch. This morning, we heard several things in the opening addresses. The one that struck me was something that Rebecca said in an excellent address, where she said, one of her criticisms of the EU and of Islam, she said, they both wield power in such a way as to make you subjects. They both want to dominate you. They want to make you subject of the state. And I would say that is correct. But is it any less true of the instincts of some populists? How free is the average American looking right now from the president? Or is it not the case that in the US right now, the world's most prominent populist governor of a country is in fact an everyday presence in the lives of his citizens, to the extent that they have to turn on the news every morning to find out what he's done next? Wielding power is not just about the arbitrary pulling of levers. We have to ask ourselves if we, and by the way, I consider myself to be somebody who is very much aligned with the European populist movement, but we have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. The first one is, what is the end goal of European populism? I look out this window, or this one, and I see the higgledy-piggledy evidence of 3,000 years of European civilization, in all of its ups and all of its downs. And I think we are all in this room, those of us who consider ourselves conservatives, populists, nationalists, whatever label you want to apply, I think we are in this room because we believe when we look out that window, there are fundamental things that are worth conserving. And some of us are here because we feel those things are under threat. I heard earlier on a remark that you can't walk into Molenbeek without questioning whether this is Europe anymore or not. That was a remark made from this stage earlier on today, and there are people here who fundamentally believe that that is the animating reason why they're here today. To which my question is, if you had power in the morning, what would you do to make Molenbeek feel more European? Now, some of you will answer that question with, I would deport everybody. And I would say that is not feasible or realistic, because wielding power is not just about pulling levers and saying, I'll do something dramatic. It is about having a long-term strategy to get from where you are to where you want to go. Now, I'll give you an example of how this is from my own country. In Ireland, 73% of the voters tell opinion pollsters that they believe that immigration is too high. Now, when Lorenzo stood up here this morning, he said, and I quote, that the populist right is about providing simple, common-sense solutions to obvious problems. And he gave that specific example. He said, immigration is too high, we close the borders. And I say, well, that is okay until you realise that not only do 76% of Irish people feel immigration is too high, 93% of Irish people want to remain members of the European Union and say they want to remain members of the European Union because they value open borders, free trade and the access it gives them to go on their holidays to Spain without using a passport or whatever it is they think they get. And those two positions are fundamentally very difficult to reconcile. How do you shutter the Irish border while maintaining what the voters also want, which is continued access to the community of nations that the European Union has become, whether we in this room like that fact or dislike it? And you can win one argument, but if you're winning that argument while losing another, then you will, first of all, not be in power for very long, and secondly, you will be very unlikely to wield that power. I'll give you another example of a big question that I don't think populists have an answer to, which is a really important question. What percentage of our young people should go to university? Do populists have an answer to that question? Because I think it is one of the most fundamental questions facing Europe and the Western world today. Frank, in his speech this morning, made some wonderful points. But he said something that kind of annoyed me. He said, this is not about left versus right. This is about elites versus the people. But every society needs elites. Every successful society in human history. We had populares and the optimates in ancient Rome mentioned here, and the debate there was whether Cato was right that Rome should be ruled by the elite senatorial class, or whether Caesar and his friends were right that it should be the will of the people. But both of them had a point. Every society needs elites. That is why when Augustus took power after that civil war, he imposed a system of governance by elites. Every society needs elites, which brings me back to the question, how many of our young people should go to university? Because I would say one of the biggest problems we have in Europe is that our elites are no longer elite. They call themselves the elites, and we call them the elites, but they are not, in fact, elite. We have a situation where we are sending young people to universities in their tens of thousands, and hardly anybody is going to be an apprentice or learn how to be a plumber or learn how to be a carpenter, and we're importing people to do those jobs while we put overeducated people who frankly are not intelligent enough into policy institutions around the world, and they spend their time thinking, well, what will I talk about trans rights? The purpose of elites in any society is to transmute popular opinion, and by the way, popular opinion is sometimes terrible. Populists talk about being populists. The public are sometimes stupid. You know, if you ask an Irish person what is the worst thing the government has done in the last year, they will tell you it was when they spent 450,000 euros building a bus shelter outside the Oireachtas. That's an outrageous sum of money. Or they will say it is the amount of money they spent on the government jet. Because the average person connects, and I'm not blaming people for this, but they connect their emotions to very small things that stick in their mind. That is a tool for winning power, and I'm not saying that these things shouldn't be attacked. But the instincts of the public when it comes to identifying the difference between 450,000 euros spent on a bus shelter and 45 billion euros spent over 20 years on an immigration policy that's out of control, their eyes will glaze over at the bigger number and they'll focus on the smaller number. The purpose of elites in any society is to transmute the instincts of the public into acceptable policy that is also good policy. And I think the populist movement in Europe, and indeed around the world, has identified itself as so anti-elite and so pro the instincts of the public that it allows us sometimes to trip over ourselves and not think strategically. I saw somebody the other day talk about what's happening in the United States at the moment with the collapse in the value of the stock markets, as summing it all up as, you know, the new philosophy on the American populist right is thou shalt own nothing except the libs. Because this is the other problem that we have. Many of us, and I do not speak for everybody in the room, nor do I pretend to, but too many people in this movement, in Europe for my mind, Judge the outcome and success of a policy position by the volume of shrieks of horror it provokes from the people on the other side of the fence. And this is something that I speak particularly from the media space, because one of the biggest challenges we have as an audience, as an organisation that tries to report the news, is not to be dragged down rabbit holes by people whose instinct, particularly in the era of the online era with Elon Musk and so on, is to follow and chase every rabbit hole that provides clicks, audience and revenue. So for example, during COVID-19, we had the perfectly acceptable populist position that lockdowns are bad. We had the perfectly acceptable populist position that vaccine mandates are bad. And then we had, I think, too many people in Europe in political positions getting themselves seduced into the entirely untenable and unbacked by evidence position that COVID vaccines are actually killing tens of thousands of people, and basing their reputations and their credibilities on that. And I think one of the difficulties we have as a movement is in translating our anger at what we see happening outside those windows into an achievable vision of where we want to be in 20 years and what are the levers that we wish to pull to get there. I'll finish with this. We've all heard the phrase, the long march through the institutions. And the most important thing that any populist political government can do is to reverse that long march through the institutions, to begin a systemic purge of the media, of academia, of attacking the centres of power that have led the poisonous ideology of liberal progressivism into the position of cultural dominance in which it is today. And yet, with some notable exceptions, and the Hungarian government is one such notable exception, there are very few populist parties in Europe that I see, and I know I'm not omniscient, but that I see with a coherent plan to actually do that, because it is incredibly difficult. Wielding power does not simply mean winning an election. Wielding power means accepting that on day one you are in a fight with the institutions of the state which have been captured and are organised to work against you and will be organised to work against you for the entire length of your 5-year term. So you've got to have a strategy to win the public over to your side on actually dismantling their power structures piece by piece. Margaret Thatcher's fight with the trade unions was mentioned earlier on today as an example of the failure of conservatism, because the consequences of that were that we lost touch with the culture war. That's true. But there's an example in that, because what she did in having that fight was to break the power and what was the stifling power of the British trade union system once and for all. And that lesson should not be forgotten. Whether you think the breaking of that power was a good thing, and I'm sure there are some people here who think it was a bad thing, that is what she achieved. The dominance of market liberalism, whether you like it or not, was achieved by taking on deeply entrenched enemies in a position of immensely privileged power within the British economic system and breaking their power. That is why the name Iron Lady, though it was applied to her by the Soviets, has stuck as a sobriquet many years after her departure. And I wonder, when we look in this room, whose is the power in Europe that we want to break irreparably so that we can unleash a new era of populism, conservatism, common sense, whatever you want to call it, and what is our strategy to go about breaking that power? I'm not sure it is there, which is why the Italian populist government under Salvini failed, why populism has struggled, I think, to articulate a long-term governing philosophy, and why there is still work to be done. I don't want to be the bucket of cold water in what has been an amazing conference, but I think the question is not with respect how can we wield power, but can we wield it effectively and strategically in a way that will change Europe for 100 years, for 200 years, so that people will look back on our generation in the same way that they look back on previous generations that actually did something long-lasting. And that lady down there with the blonde hair, who asked one question earlier on, which was the one that stuck with me today, when she challenged the panel and she said, "What about the people who don't agree with you?" They're the people we have to bring along, actually. We are the people who we have to persuade that what we want to do is not a threat to their way of lives, is not a threat to their security, their economic security. We do not need to be revolutionaries. We need to be strategic, focused, and have an end point in mind. And I'm not sure at present that that exists in a unified fashion. Thank you for letting me bore you for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Hello there. Right, first of all, I want to know who in this room is a swivel-eyed raving populist. Please put up your hand if that describes you. Blimmin' heck, I thought I was going to be among friends. This completely changes the tenor of my speech, okay? Now I know that I'm not in a comfort zone. I'm going to have to wind my neck in a little bit. Populism, right? Where does that come from? What is that word? It actually comes from the mid-19th century, and it was set up to be essentially the antonym to the word aristocratic. And this is what we're hearing a lot, isn't it? That populism is essentially about a movement of the people rising up against the legacy parties, against the political institutions, against the governing elites. In 2017, populism was word of the year. Thanks to Brexit, and of course, thanks to the Donald 1.0. And actually, I'm pleased we're using the word populism because, frankly, I am sick to death of hearing extreme right, far right, hard right, neo-Nazis, all of the slander that attacks essentially what is the will of the people, expressed through a political machine. And why is this happening today in the 21st century? Why is there this huge wave of populism, of new parties, of entryist organizations attempting to try and dismantle the stranglehold, break out of the straitjackets within which the whole West seems to have been trapped for decades? It's because I think what's happened is democracy has been sublimated. On one hand, there has been this attempt to try with smoke and mirrors show people that actually their voice is really important. There are far more elected officials today than ever in history. I mean, blimmin' heck, in the UK, you can't actually turn a corner without bumping into some sort of politician. Welsh Assembly, Scottish Assembly, unitary authorities, local councils. At least we got rid of the MEPs, including me, can I just say. But actually, despite all of these devices that are designed to make people feel like actually democracy is functioning and it's really healthy and society is free and fair and open, we all know the opposite is actually true. Because power has been ushered upwards. It's been ushered upwards through international treaties and supranational organizations, through the power of the markets, global capitalism, the masturbatory relationship between the two, which is seen on a regular basis at Davos. Brexit was the first chip in the armor. You know us Brits, we always lead the way, we do it first. And frankly, if we're asking the question, can populism wield power, then I would say that if anybody has demonstrated that it can, is my former boss, Nigel Farage. A man who wasn't elected into the UK Parliament until last year, and yet probably had the biggest impact on not just UK politics, not even just European politics, but frankly speaking, global politics in a generation. So things can change. But as John was saying, this is about, can populism wield power in an operational sense, in terms of actually yield results? And I would suggest that there are 5 hurdles that face populism in getting to the Elysian fields of actually being able to change the world for good. The first one, as I've alluded to earlier, is the reputational fight. There's been so many decades now of supranational organizations, legacy governments telling people one particular narrative, and for a whole long time, reality wasn't really exposed. Until we had the democratizing factor of social media, information was channeled through very narrow corridors, be they certain newspapers or public broadcasters, politicians themselves. And what we have seen as a result, as people are waking up and the scales are falling away from their eyes and they're saying, I do want to criticize mass migration, that multiculturalism isn't a good thing, that actually the pound in my pocket doesn't feel as heavy as it used to anymore. And that is as a result of things that, frankly, have been taboo to talk about. And so we still face as populists a big fight to make sure that we don't suffer too much reputational damage, to make sure, as John was saying, we take people with us. Although I would suggest at the moment, in 2025, we're rock and roll. We are the zeitgeist. Now, the second is barriers to electoral participation. Marine Le Pen in France, Romania. What we have seen, and actually, you just have to look at Trump over in America and the lawfare against him, is now the establishment have woken up to the fact that something like Brexit can happen, and it did happen. Ooh, they want to make sure it doesn't happen again. And they are throwing everything into the mix to try and make it seem that actually, well, this person can't stand for election because of this technicality, because of this horror from the past. Look, I've been quizzed by Olaf for 3 hours under caution, the European Forward Office, based on absolutely naffle. They were telling me, oh, you were taking money working for the European Parliament while you were running UKIP's Assembly election campaign in Wales. And I said, no, I quit my job in December and I moved to Wales in January. And you can tell that just by phoning up HR. But no, they just wanted to have me in there and grill me. So my respect for that institution and my appreciation of what's gone on to Marine Le Pen is this was lawfare. I'm sorry, it was. The judiciary have a choice whether they want to directly impact democracy, and they chose that they did want to do that. So the second, reputational damage first. The second, the barriers to electoral participation. The third, then, of course, is the election itself, whether it's free and fair. Oh, we heard, didn't we, that the EU referendum, that was Russia involved in that. Oh, it was Cambridge Analytica and people with USB sticks full of data and all these other horror stories. We must have the vote again. It was too close. People didn't understand the question. I mean, it wouldn't have been that way the other way around. And what we're seeing increasingly as the establishment find themselves creaking under the pressure of populism is they're prepared to chuck in some gerrymandering. Well, let's change the constituencies and delay elections. Let's change the nature of the plebiscite and who is franchised. Let's give 16-year-olds to vote. And they will do anything to try and make sure that a populist party is not successful. But say you've managed to get through without the reputational damage so people want to vote for you, that you've actually been allowed to stand in the election, and then, oh my goodness, despite all of the messing about and the tactics and the manipulation, you've won. What then? Well, most populist parties are then in a situation where they have to forge a coalition. And we know what happens when you're a populist party. Nobody wants to get into bed with you. And so the legacy party ends up holding on to power, and the populist party has to take either, if they're lucky, a secondary seat. They don't get to be prime minister, but they might get to be immigration minister because that's their thing. If you're unlucky, you'll have a super coalition against you, including some pretty unsavory far-left parties who, frankly, nobody should be getting into bed with. So that's number 4. You've then got to actually try and be allowed to govern itself even if you've won. And it brings me on to number 5, which is the governing. That's great. You've done it. You're in 10 Downing Street. Nigel Farage, Prime Minister of the UK. Woohoo! Let's get out the Union Jack bunting. Well, thankfully, we're not in the EU, but we've still got a lot of bonfires to set off to get rid of some of the legacy alignment and those 10% tariffs we're getting from America because of it. But we are still subject to things like the ECHR, as we know, the next foreign rapist who can't be deported because his son doesn't like the chicken nuggets back at home. If you're not British, you might think that sounds crazy, but that happened. You've got the UN, the EU for countries in it, the Eurozone, of course, which makes leaving the EU even more difficult if you've gone into having a shared single currency. And then in the UK, the quangocracy, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations. Sounds like a load of gobbledygook, but unfortunately, there's gazillions of the damn things, and they're the ones who basically run the country and are unaccountable and unelected. The Office for Budget Responsibility, that's great, that sounds really good. That will make sure politicians don't do anything dastardly with the country's finances and get us into trouble. What it means is any Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK has to go and have their homework marked and doesn't get to do anything that's remotely radical. Then, of course, you have the markets. As I said, the masturbatory relationship in Davos. When the banks decide they don't like the direction of travel, i.e. Liz Truss, they'll make sure that she doesn't get her way. They will sell off government gilts on the cheap 24 hours before her mini-budget to crash the markets. And then, even inside the operations of government, and I don't know what it's like in other countries, but in the UK, most prime ministers are constantly at war with the civil service. The idea that ministers actually run something is for the birds. They're marionettes. It's unelected civil servants who decide what is government policy, what they're willing to do. And so actually, if we want to wield power and yield power from it, there has to be a radical overhaul. I'm talking about leaving those supranational organizations. I'm talking about getting rid of supreme courts. I'm talking about getting out of the ECHR. I'm talking about doing all the sorts of things that the international community are going to look at you and judge you to be a pariah state. They're going to think you've gone absolutely tonto. But actually, unless you can shake off what is essentially 8 decades of a growing Gordian knot of legacy legislation, international treaties, supranational organizations, then you've got absolutely zero room to maneuver. It's all for the birds. It's bunkum, it's vacuous, it's hollow. But do I have hope? Do you know what? I do. Because, 20 years ago when I first met Nigel Farage, the idea of leaving the EU seemed mad. We were called swivel-eyed lunatics, closet racists, fruitcakes. And the idea that there might even be a referendum and then lo and behold we could win it just seemed so impossible, and yet it happened. And since then, look at what else has happened. Look at all these new parties springing up around Europe, making massive gains in elections, fighting against this system that doesn't even want them to exist, and still there, persistently winning more and more members of the public's hearts. Like I said, we are the new rock and roll. And so things are happening faster than I expected. And it occurred to me, and this is something John was alluding to, and I think he's correct on this. It's on my bullet points here. I didn't nick it from you. Which is, we left the EU because we thought, you can't reform the damn thing. We were 1 foot out anyway. We didn't want the single currency and Schengen and all of that. We're British. We've got island mentality. But there's a new approach now with the Eurosceptic parties in Brussels. They've decided that they now have power in numbers. Where once upon a time, someone like Viktor Orban would have 0 friends in that European Parliament, he would go in and get slaps on the back from what is now the 3rd biggest political grouping in the hemicycle. And there is a possibility of creating a coalition of the right, that smaller countries that remember what it was like to live under the USSR and don't want to go back into that and don't want to feel shackled and straitjacketed by unelected bureaucrats in a different country. They were a bit sad when we left because we were kind of, Britain was the big boy in the room who said, whoa, hold on, this project's a bit weird. We don't want to be doing that. But they've realized that they can create strength in numbers, that all of a sudden when you've got Meloni and you've got Orban, and if we were to have Marine Le Pen and you've got Geert Wilders, that you've suddenly got people who can sit around a table and say, hey, together we can dismantle this thing that we don't like. Because the problem is this Gordian knot that we're in, it's every way you turn, every single vine you cut to try and get to the center of the maze, there's another one ahead of you. And they also have the ability to grow back pretty quickly. And yet, empires come, empires go. At one point, it would have seemed the USSR was there to stay forever. And look how quickly that unraveled. I think we're on the cusp of seeing something change, and something change quite dramatically. I think we've now live in an age that the public have woken up that they won't believe the lies and they won't be shamed by the taboo anymore. And I think that this is now a juggernaut that cannot be stopped. So can populists wield power? You better believe it, and we're coming.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for all being here. And to be honest with you, I thought I would be the first to speak. So I prepared something a bit casual, a bit more technical, more political. And after my 2 friends, John and Alex, I'll try to do my best and to do it a bit more just as I can. All right, so Alex, you were talking about that Zeitgeist. And I do think, exactly as you said, that here we are. That's a great moment in Europe. All the populist parties are emerging. They're spreading everywhere, even if the system tries to kill them, to make them disappear, as we saw in Romania, or we are seeing, because it's not done, as we saw in Germany with the AFD, sorry for my horrible French accent. So it's our time. But so we have to be ready. And as John said, I'm not sure we are. But I will develop that point a bit later. I would like to go back to that topic that you said about the elite and the people. So sometimes there is a confusion. We say that populist, and of course being populist is to defend the people and to carry the voice of the people, but of all the people. And we are also conservatives. So that could be antinomic, but it has not to be. And I would come back to this divorce between the actual elite, not the future elite, who is here, but the actual elite, or that is sometimes called the deep state, or those who are sat on the nice chair and holding to it, and they're grabbing it, and they don't want to go away, even if everybody told them you're completely corrupted, and you're doing policies that the people don't want. So they divorced from the people, and they've been nurtured by a post-national ideology. I don't know if I'm clear, but they're like, nation are out of fashion. We need to be a big global village, and everything has to be free. The citizens have to be the same, so we can exchange them. They're just data that we can move wherever we want. And there'll be too many, don't you think? So maybe those who are really useless, we should get rid of them. If they would like to go with honor, I don't know if you heard this notion, but you can die in good condition, go in good condition if you want. It's not suicide anymore. It's just that you decide to go away with honor. Why not to help them and furnish them the tools to do it? So our elite is in this set of mind. And I also heard you and listened to you when you were talking about the USSR. And I do think that we are actually presently in the EU-SSR, because our actual elite, because they want to keep the power and also keep the good money that goes with it, need to be more and more totalitarian. They need to bend the people, force the will of the people, or to say differently, as Bertolt Brecht said, if the people doesn't vote properly, just change the people. And we'll come back to that, because I was saying that with Scarlett, who is the most delicious journalist in the world. They also change the population. They are changing the population, and that's linked to the policy, the immigration policy. So to go back to the main question, and I haven't the timer, so if somebody can tell me if I'm too long or where I am, feel free. Be the time master. Can populist party willpower? Let me be clear from that start. Yes, absolutely. And they must, because today populist parties are often the only one truly listening to the people and daring to challenge a political system that no longer represents them. But to go back to the challenge that you were talking about, and just to take your example about Molenbeek or Schaerbeek. I used to live in Schaerbeek, and that was pretty sportive for me. I have the example, because I used to work in India, I have the example of India, who had a great problem with Islamism. And they dealt it not in a totalitarian way or a brutal way, saying, oh, let's just send them back over not oversee, because in fact over Pakistan, to Pakistan, but they started by changing the law, saying, okay, they can't have mosques in public space. If they want to practice their religion, it's only in their home, because India is an Hindi country. And step by step, they changed all the laws that were pro-Muslim. So the Muslim had to just behave like proper Indians and keep their faith for them in their private space. They did the same, whether it didn't went as far as in Europe with all the LGBTQI++ whatever rules. So it was like, okay, if you, especially in the south, because in North India it's pretty strict about that. But they were like, if you wanna have a particular sexual identity, it's your problem. It's not a public problem. It has nothing to do with public affairs. And they did that in a very smooth way, as they know how to do, because they're very supple, changed the law. So why not to do that in Europe? And that could be a good start for a strategy, because we definitely need a long-term strategy to fight what will be in front of us when we'll have the power. So I do think brain and brilliant brains like the brains who are with me could start that work, and maybe that would give us a start, a base to start, and to all work efficiently, because we politicians need brains to help us. I don't know where I am about the time. Okay, no problem. So I had also this idea about education. You were talking about education and how many people, how many students or young people we need to bring to university. And definitely, I do think that the right to be educated and to masterize the basis of education that are reading, writing, and counting. Those bases are not masterized today, and before being elected, I was giving some lessons to kids from 16, teenager, from 16 to 28. They didn't know how to write properly. They didn't know how to analyze something or synthesize something. They had the IQ of not even an 11-year-old kid of my generation. So that was terrible for me. And they weren't dumb. It's just that the educational system didn't train them. And I do think, first, restore those basics learning, and don't, for this time, for election purpose, make the parents believe that you can carry by force a kid who has abilities in other fields that only the intellectual fields to a master or whatever. This kid will be much more happier and even richer. I can tell you that my plumber is more precious and more expensive than a lawyer. So I don't know if we say a plumber, the man who is doing the pipes. Yep. Yeah, he's and horribly busy. I love him, by the way. So anyway, so just to make people feel proud of what they're gifted for, because we all need everybody. I couldn't work if the woman who's cleaning my office wouldn't clean him. So she's precious, and we have to stop this division between, like just intellectual work and manual work. And by the way, some manual work need real intelligence. So maybe 20% to the university would be good. And another thing, and to finish with it, I wanted to talk about the problem of trust with the people, between politicians, between institution and the people. There is a real trust problem, and I do think we have to really heal that problem and solve it. And maybe some some new tech like blockchain could be a good solution, especially for finances. And of course, the politicians have to be exemplary. So thank you for listening to me, and thank you for being here.
This is difficult, isn't it? I've been in the rare situation of both nodding my head and shaking my head at things my fellow panelists have said in almost equal measure, but it was John who's done such a great work at Gript in building a genuine new institution, who went first and who caught my attention in such a peculiar way that I feel I have to respond to a few of the things that he said. And he said three claims that I really, as a populist, really take issue with, and hopefully they provide a little bit of a framing to what I really want to talk about, which is how we can wield power, effectively or not, but how we can wield power and how we should think about wielding power. So one thing John said was that we need elites, and of course, on the face of it, like you can't deny, nobody denies you need some useful people who know what they're doing, who know what they're about, and all the rest of it. But I can't help but feel that in the current context, that statement is so often a sleight of hand to say we need the elites because what we don't need are these people. We don't need the regular people involved, and we need to be so suspicious of them. And indeed, that's something John said, which was the second thing I kind of took issue with, which is that so often the public are a bit too stupid and too emotional to really be trusted with great matters of state. And I don't know. I think there's more wisdom in those people who objected to a overpriced bus stop than there is in the planning inspectors who produced reams and reams of pages of paper to justify placing the bus stop in the first place. I think there's more wisdom in the people who object to our hotel being open next door to them to house migrants than hundreds of business leaders who tell us how much we need their cheap labour. There's more wisdom, as the famous quote has it, in the random 100 people from the phone book than there are in the board of one of our universities. So I think I side with the people on that one. But maybe the thing that really I took issue with more than anything else is when John said, we don't need to be revolutionaries. Because I actually think the challenge in front of us, the scale of the problem that faces us is so vast that we really do need to think a bit more like revolutionaries, and we could do with thinking in a revolutionary spirit to be really serious about upending some of the major institutions and governing ideas of our time. So let me just whistle through a few of those, which is really what I came here to talk about today. So first, and this has already thankfully been alluded to, but one thing we need to be much more revolutionary about are the courts. And we know in different European countries that the courts have stymied deportations of criminals and terrorists, forced countries to accept elements of the LGBT agenda, have offended basic sovereignty in countries. And even when these international courts are not involved, the human rights agenda has become so part and parcel of even national politics that the international courts often don't even need to be involved because the local courts have kind of swallowed their ideology wholesale. And this is something I get into arguments with my colleagues and friends here in Brussels, because lots of people think that the answer is just to kind of ignore the courts subtly or silently when they vote in ways that we don't like. And maybe this just offends my British sensibility, but and it's often, no offense, actually, my French friends who say, no, we'll just ignore it, it's fine, we'll just pretend it didn't happen. But I think if we're really serious about getting into power and wielding power, we need to recognize that, in some sense, we also need the law on our side. The scale of the reforms that we need to implement can only happen in a modern society if there are a set of rules for people to follow, if the institutions and the bureaucrats and all the rest of it can be relied on to implement things in a kind of rational and law-oriented way. In other words, we do need a regime of law to underpin our politics. So I think we need to have a very radical solution to the judicial overreach that dominates our politics. And maybe there are lots of different options on the table, but something I would like to throw out there as one suggestion is the adoption of a very basic sovereignty law in every country across Europe that would mandate that all disputes ruled on in local courts, in national courts, they're never sent to international courts outside our jurisdictions, and that would also at the same time set strict limits on the interpretation of EU or other international treaties. Some countries kind of get away with this already. Germany gets away with a lot of this through the Grundgesetz and is allowed a huge amount of latitude because it's the European paymaster in not necessarily always following European law. But such a sovereignty law would specify and clarify really important matters around refugee conventions, family life rights, the concept of labour mobility, all areas that have been expanded under the guise of judicial intervention. And if such a law was the end of EU legal supremacy, so be it. But it was already a fiction. So I think we should be much more revolutionary about our approach to the courts. Another area we need to be very serious and very revolutionary is in the civil service, the state bureaucracy. And we've already heard an allusion to the idea of the deep state kind of refusing to implement the policies of patriotic governments. And we know in Germany and in France, we know this is a genuine and real threat. And here, I mean, the problem is that there can only be a long-term solution to this problem. We need a cadre, maybe a Leninist kind of cadre of patriotic and politically motivated individuals who are prepared to enter into, rise through the ranks of the civil service. And we can do things, I guess, to make the civil service more attractive to these people. We could learn from the success of, for example, the Federalist Society in the US, who carefully curated an entire generation or multiple generation of lawyers and judges and got them into important positions in office. So in the there's a long-term battle, something we need to be really serious and single-minded about. But maybe in the short term, we could do a couple of things too. We could maybe have a little bit of Elon Musk-inspired liquidation of the bureaucratic classes. We can encourage some to leave, sure, on friendly terms. Some people have even talked of somehow having a grand bargain with the bureaucrats. We'll have fewer of you, but we'll pay you better, we'll give you better conditions or whatever, or we need some leaders to come in and break up the system. I'm sure there are short-term fixes too, but the real problem of the bureaucracy as such is something that requires very careful, long-term, systemic action around, and something that I think many people are not nearly serious enough about. Another area we could be a little revolutionary is in the general field of culture, in arts, education, and civil society, because here the problem in all these areas, whether you're talking about theatres or NGOs, the problem we have is basically the same. We've got lots of historically valuable institutions which have been completely captured ideologically and practically. And the rank and file, the leadership certainly, and often the rank and file of these institutions have kind of adopted the precise opposite of the reason why we set these institutions up. They sell hatred for our history, disdain towards our culture, and they demonstrate a desire to indoctrinate us, and especially our youth, into a completely new way of thinking. And of course, while they're at it, they siphon off vast amounts of money. And maybe here I get slightly more radical, but we've been doing lots of work on NGOs, so the fire's in my belly about this. But I think first here we'd have to ruthlessly defund the most hostile institutions. NGOs are a good place to start, but I say this as someone who likes the university, but a great number of universities have to go to the wall, a great number. We have to, secondly, build alternative institutions and commit serious money to doing so. I mean, I'd like to see a populist party commit to opening several dozen schools and at least a couple of universities within a couple of years of being in power. Open an arts centre with the power to grant interesting young artists an opportunity. Find outsiders, cultural radicals to take these on. Fund research institutions on pressing problems. And also, people have to kind of commit to the institutions in these forms. Populist parties should, for example, appoint serious intellectuals to boards or rectorships, encourage young patriotic people to go into teaching, perhaps with scholarships, and be seen to be visibly supporting culture. Lots of the patriotic parties seem very uncomfortable about our cultural inheritance. I mean, and then another area we could be quite radical. I mean, given what Trump's doing, we probably have to say something about the economy. And we can have it's hardly come up, but we could have an interesting debate on tariffs. But I think at the core of any populist revolution, any true radicalism in populism, we have to be a lot more serious about economic matters than we are currently. And I think the key thing would be to ruthlessly break the hold of the zombie and the vampire companies in our national economies. The zombie companies are those that exist only through the largesse of the state, but have ceased to be innovative. And the vampire companies kind of look successful, but they leech off the productive work of other sectors. And to complete my supernatural metaphor, we could also get rid of the ghost companies, those that used to provide good manufacturing jobs, but have kind of shipped them all abroad, leaving only a shadow of themselves. Obvious policies: abolish net zero, make energy plentiful, invest in lots of nuclear power, dig everything up from the ground that we can find. Those are obvious things, but and one thing John said that was very right, actually, was that populist parties have been found wanting in the reality of trade-offs. How do we transition from the severely, severely unproductive world that we live in, especially in Europe, to a productive one? That's going to be painful. That's going to be very, very difficult. We need more of a robust plan to get from A to B, to say to people, Jorge in one of the earlier, or maybe it wasn't, somebody in one of the earlier discussions said that if you've got a vision, you can tell people there's going to be some danger and some difficulty along the way. Hey, this is not going to be easy. We're in a bad, bad situation. We need you, we're going to go somewhere better. We need you to trust us. That's what we face with the economy. But what I wanted to finish with was something that maybe is the hardest bit and the most revolutionary bit for populist parties that they need to get right. And that's the power of ideas. We need a vision, a narrative of the kind of society that we're trying to build. It's obvious what we're all against: uncontrolled immigration, the pollution of history, the decline of our economies, and so on. But very few populist parties have managed to say what we should be for. And our coalition is very fragile. It includes traditional conservatives, business elites, betrayed working classes, and so on. And it's never quite clear what it is that we want to do. But this lack of ideological cohesion is what seems to lead time and again to the fracturing of right-wing or populist forces every time they enter power. And it means fundamentally that these areas I've said we need to tackle, the courts, the civil service, reforming the economy, we're not going to stand a chance of putting up a fight, and it will be a hell of a fight, unless we got a core sense of what we're about, unless we've had the arguments with ourselves, had it out amongst ourselves about what it is that we really stand for, because you can be sure that they will try to fight and conquer us when the going gets tough. So, in conclusion, I think a measure of seriousness is 100% needed. A measure of radicalism is 100% needed. And above all, what's needed is courage. Populist parties have got to rediscover that courage that is what ultimately gets people to put an X in the box of a party that they were told their whole lives are never, ever supposed to be allowed to vote for. And if populist leaders demonstrated a lot of the courage that was on display from populist voters, I think the task would be a lot more straightforward for us. Thank you.
Well, that was a lot of fun. I'd like to hear from you now. Please raise your hand if you'd like to raise a question, a comment. I'm going to take Ashley here. Microphones? Sorry, just wait a moment. Ashley.
Thanks. Ashley Frawley, visiting researcher, MCC Brussels. I agreed with a lot of what you said, Jacob, but as you were talking, I had this kind of nagging worry at the back of my mind. You know, this kind of, advocating a kind of entryism, I suppose, this sort of overtake of institutions in this quasi-clandestine way, the desire to re-educate young people. Isn't that exactly what the left had done? And how is it, well, what the left was doing was itself an attempt to evade democracy, to remake society, to avoid the fact that they themselves were unpopular. So we're unpopular, the people don't like us, we'll just remake the people. And so this desire to say, well, we'll just play the same game. We will be the ones who take over the institutions under everyone's noses. We will be the ones who will re-educate young people. I feel like I was just a bit worried about taking a page from that same playbook.
Lovely. Please, this gentleman here. Please stand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for the beautiful talks. My question was actually if the panel thinks that ideology is a reflection of how power is wielded. Or, to put it in another way, can the right use the administrative state to wield power? Because there is this analysis that says that the leftist kind of liberal progressive ideology and view of humans is actually a reflection of this managerial, administrative kind of way of organizing society.
Okay.
And so you get into this problem of, do you want to fight cannons with swords? And if your ideology is the ideology of swords, like, don't you want to have cannons to win, or like how are you going to take power if you don't?
Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't accept the more powerful option. Yeah.
Thank you. Here, Richard. Sorry. Oh.
Hello. Yeah. Rebecca, journalist with Document Media. Maybe I'm simplifying this, but the way I look at populism, and I guess you could say the opposite to the left, is to make boring sexy again. Like boring politics, like, you know how it used to be back in the day when you took care of the infrastructure, where you did things that politicians were supposed to do before they got all revolutionary and wanting to create a legacy instead of having children. So how do we go about making politics boring, and thereby making boring sexy again?
Okay. So anybody on the panel want to pick up any of that?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Jacob.
Well, I actually asked me a direct question.
She did.
Well, the difference is that there are many differences, maybe. The first is that I don't propose doing anything clandestine. So I'll happily stand up here and advocate for it and tell my friends that, and if I became somehow in a position of power, I'd say, right, we're going to open these new universities, we're going to fund you to go and become teachers and all the rest of it. And I'm not proposing that we try and avoid the public debate. I'm saying that we've got to have a much broader conception of politics than we're used to working with. It's not just about successfully maneuvering people into a position of power, winning an election by 1 or 2%, and then kind of washing your hands and saying the job is done. Instead, we've got to have a much more kind of, as I say, radical whole root and branch approach to what it is that we think we're doing politically. And if I may just quickly answer the question on the administrative state, and should we just wield that power against it? I take the view that the structures of the administrative bureaucracy that we live under kind of always propose already their own particular politics, so that you can't have a conservative, patriotic, administrative state. It's just we can't use it for our own terms, because in order to think of people as managerial blocks, you've got to slot into different positions. You're already thinking of them without their history, without their family, without their culture, deprived of any kind of economic resilience and so on. And so sure, we should want to reform the bureaucracies and put useful people in them, but we can't just take this technocratic state that we have and try and use it against our enemies.
Okay, I'm going to go to John. John, I think your microphone is working, no?
Okay.
You don't need that. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here. I think the idea that I probably didn't elaborate on as much in my speech kind of relates to the questions from Ashley about about if we can infiltrate or use the institutions. And my attitude to this is that they have to be dismantled. I don't think you can infiltrate them or use them. I mean, we talk a lot about, at the end of my speech I posed a question, like what is the power structure that we have a strategy to dismantle in a way that has a lasting effect on our society? And one very convincing answer provided by Jake was the courts. And I agree, the courts need enormous reform, or need their wings clipped, or essentially there are strong arguments, I think, from a populist conservative point of view for a European constitutional document that significantly restrains the power of the courts, because there is no point in winning elections if your power is overturned by judicial fiat. But the other one is the academic institutions and the universities. If you think about what purpose the common agricultural policy serves in Europe, it is to subsidize the continued production of Irish beef farmers and French wheat farmers whose products cannot be sold on the market. What is the purpose of the glut of NGOs that exists across the European Union's member states? It is the common agricultural policy for people who should never have gone to university. That is what those institutions are. We have an elite system which is producing people in vast numbers and then requires the state to find them jobs, which is why over the 41 years of my life, we have gone from having had hardly any state-funded NGOs in Europe to every country having several thousand state-funded NGOs, and to the state having engaged in this system where now every element of society has some state-funded NGO representing it. The disabled people have one, but not only one for disabled people, one for every category of disabled people, one for every societal ailment, sometimes dozens to represent individual groups, all of them sucking off the taxpayer. But the ultimate effect of that is two things. First of all, you're creating an enormous electorate that will never ever vote for populists because its entire economic structure is based on the fact that it leaches from the taxpayer. Right. And number two, you are also subsidising your ideological enemies. So I think to do that, you need to slash education, specifically the universities.
Thanks, John. Alex, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's picking up a little bit on what John's just said there. I think one thing that unites all right-wing parties, populist parties, is the idea of a small state. And that is making the boring sexy again, right? You don't need people sitting there making laws on hate speech. That's not a thing. We have got so many layers of nonsense legislation. We've heard from successive right-wing governments in the UK, we're going to have a bonfire of the quangos, etc. We need to gut out the civil service. It's way too bloated. We need to look at the Supreme Court and decide whether we actually want that. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure as well that we have a great repeal act and get rid of all the rubbish legislation that clogs up the system, which is very often misused, and strip it back to doing what needs to be done in politics, not stuff which is basically creating a whole load of unnecessary quangos, which just add layers of bureaucracy onto life and costs the taxpayer huge amounts of money.
Thank you. Angeline? You can just speak into your microphone.
All right. Hope everybody can hear me. I don't have a loud voice like...
Oh.
Yes, sorry, you actually do.
Oh, you do need a microphone. Sorry.
Hello? Oh, perfect. Right. I will start by the end. And tell you to make it sexy. Let's talk about duty, because duty is sexy. And politics should be about duty. We are serving the people. So let's change this set of mind among the people who are ruling the country, and let's select them about this ability to serve and not about their greed and their ambition. And maybe there is some things to change to select the right people. To go back to how to create, so I thought it was the beautiful lady in black just behind my colleague who was scared about just doing what the left did. And I agree with you. I wouldn't like to do that or to be involved in politics who would do that. And I do think we should create a social space for everybody. But not forget about the tradition. What is the tradition? The tradition is what worked and our ancestor transmitted to us. So to try to revolution everything is just to forget what works. Right. And then that's it.
That's it.
I had something to say about neutrality of the
Very
techno
quickly.
and the court and
I would like to get more
administration.
people in. If you want to say it very, very quickly.
But that's obvious. Just make it compulsory for all the technician, administrators, people in the courts to be neutral. So that would be a good start.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Raise your hands, please, if you want to get in a question towards the end. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your speeches. I wanted to make a general comment or question because Davos was mentioned now, the World Economic Forum was mentioned in the previous panel.
Yeah.
I actually went to the World Economic Forum, even though, contrary to what the Spanish gentleman suggested, I'm not super rich, not yet. But I have very good connections, and so I was invited by the John Wubbe, the president of the Flemish Club, and I went, and indeed I saw some conservative people there, to my surprise. But I think that's a very good thing, because the way I see it is, I don't know about Davos because I never went there, but for sure the WEF is an institution that's here to stay. And it's an institution that we should try to infiltrate is not the correct word, but gain a presence in. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, it's a different ball game than, let's say, education or the media. But to give one small anecdote, I was talking to the head of a think tank from France, I forgot the name, and we were talking about reindustrializing Europe, scratching all the BS environmental stuff, doing, realpolitik, carving our own way, independent of the United States. So it was quite a based man. Okay. And it was in like a crypto event. Mm-hmm. So those people are there. Mm-hmm. I think there can be more there. I think, we have to make our presence infiltrate these institutions. I understand the criticism of these places, but there are also opportunities.
Okay. Bruno.
I think some of the questions that are being grappled with are the age-old questions of politics. And one of the age-old questions of politics, of trying to achieve power and then wielding it, is the question of leadership. Where does leadership come from? The fight for leadership, the fight to lead your society, a fight to lead a democratic society, almost creates the basis for institutions. It's really interesting that it's a phenomenon of the post-war era where people find it baffling, the idea that you build new institutions. It wasn't so before. If you look at popular movements right across Europe, from the German SPD on one case, trade union movements in Britain, they built their own institutions quite often. State education began because education was already happening. There were huge movements to do so. Building institutions is part of the duty of leadership. It's one of the duties of being a citizen in a democracy. To be a democrat, to be a citizen, you do sometimes have to have the courage, as Arendt, but to step outside the comfort of your home, of your everyday life, and to assume the responsibility for the world. And if you look back in history, if you look back at moments where the question of the leadership of society becomes acute and a new leadership emerges, you do get new institutions almost automatically, organically springing into life. The intellectual questions of where should society go, how do we defend our traditions and our inheritance, begs the question of creating new universities that are about intellectual leadership and excellence rather than producing pieces of paper or graduates to work in high street retail.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I do feel that perhaps in some of this discussion we're putting the cart before the horse. So I think the key point for me was what Jacob said about our ideas, about what we're for. Because unless we are clear about that, then we haven't got anything that we can inspire a movement from. And once we have that, and we can inspire a vision that people will flock to and will vote for, not just simply out of frustration of what exists, but because they want to endorse something positively, then you're in a position to actually effect change. Because unlike, and contrary to any kind of clandestine, movement into the state or whatever, you do it in public. These discussions with the civil service, of shaking out the civil service, of all that should happen in public. The whole point about the operation of the technocrats today is that all of this is hidden from the public.
Okay.
The public are excluded. If our vision is centered in the people and gives vent to those aspirations, they have to be at the table. So nothing is done behind closed doors. We do this all out into the open, and that's they themselves feel the need to be accountable.
Okay.
That's how we'll change it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to our panelists and start with you, John. Do you have any sort of final thoughts, having experienced the day, made a presentation, listened to the audience? Do you have any final thoughts that you can leave us with? Yeah, especially on the question at hand, obviously.
Yeah, look, I don't think anyone is doubting, and I certainly didn't mean to cast doubt in my remarks, on the commitment or the intellectual energy or indeed the public demand for essentially the product we're discussing here today. What I do think is that product is still at a point where it needs to be refined. And that what that gentleman just said at the end is entirely correct. There is almost universal agreement across the populist movement worldwide about what we are against. I think we could all list 10 things. We're all against them. What are we for instead? And how can we enact a positive governing agenda that says we will dismantle X, Y, and Z, but we will also build A, B, and C? And what does that look like? And further, I think, and we haven't had the conversation today, the opportunity to discuss economic policy, but I keep hearing the gentleman there said, for example, bringing manufacturing back to Europe. And I think there is a danger of us going down rabbit holes where we start saying things like, well, we're going to bring back manufacturing. Well, what does that look like? What are those manufacturing jobs going to be? What level of income do we think is going to result from them? Who do we think is going to work in those jobs? Because if it is just building more BMWs in Bavaria, as much as I love BMWs, I'm not sure that is a sustainable economic model for Europe. And I think we have to distinguish between what is nostalgia for the world outside the window as it was 20 years ago and what is viable for the world 20 years into the future. I'm not necessarily certain that that involves bringing back manufacturing jobs to Europe, particularly when we lag so behind the Americans in services. So I think there's a really positive conversation to have moving forward. I think there's a massive case for more European coordination on these issues, but I also think there is a danger sometimes of complacency, sitting back, looking at what the trends and going, well, if we just shout about immigration consistently, the voters will reward us with power. Okay. That won't work.
Thank you, John. Alex.
I'm going to slightly disagree with John, actually, although I love John. He says a lot of cool things. I'm worried about us constantly framing everything in the Yeah, I don't like framing everything. I don't like framing everything in the guise of Europe, okay? It's Europe that got us into a lot of mess, and it is about what we need to dismantle and what we need to strip back to get to where we used to be as individual nations, you know? When we talk about a manufacturing policy, what is good for Britain isn't going to be good for Hungary. We have to have our own bespoke governance. We need to be a continent of heterogeny, because actually when you have that diversity, diversity breeds competition, competition creates innovation. What we have had for so long now, which is why Europe's in the doldrums, is this sort of flabby homogeny where we're trying to make one particular law or policy that's going to suit Britain and Poland and the Czech Republic and France. Let us get back to being nation states again, looking after our people how we see fit, based upon democracy. They elect us in and out, and get rid of the idea that we have to do things in lockstep as a continent. Let's work together. Let's cooperate, let's trade, let's have animated discussions, but we don't need to have a 27-legged race, because believe me, you will not reach the finish line that way.
Excellent. No, you? Yeah.
I completely agree with you, Alex. And I also agree with Mr. with you, sir, sorry, about the fact that we need a vision, but we need a vision for each country, and this vision has to be built by the people in transparency. I do agree also, and this is where the new techs, we have the means now to do everything secured and transparent with the new techs, technology. So keep the best of the past, take the best of what we have now, and let's just build that. If I have learned something through my life, and especially through my military education, is that there's no need to do a big plan. I also learned that in England. When you have a plan, the plan will fail. So let's have a minimum with big directive lines and win the power, and then we'll deal with it. Because thinking too much is very good, and we need big brains to give us ideas. I'm not staring at you, John. To give us ideas and to make us go forward. But we also need to really wield the power.
Thank you. Jacob.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Well, thankfully, I have one of these. The point from Bruno about institutions was very, very important, and they do kind of spring up naturally. Machiavelli, who's been mentioned quite a few times today, that was the main thing I learned reading and rereading the discourses, was that, as the contemporary language has it, you can just do things. You can just imagine new things. You can come up, you can be in a situation, a historical situation, and rather than trying to respond to it with the kind of tired old ways of the past, you can just invent a new institution. You can come up with some new way of responding to what are very difficult and different circumstances. But the one thing that really requires, which we don't nearly have enough of, is a sense of a kind of courageous openness to the future, a desire that you can just go out and attempt things, and they might not work, and you might mess up on the way, but it's only through the process of engaging and being knocked back a couple of times by reality that you have a chance to build something lasting. And really, that was the one thing I wanted to hammer home from my remarks today, was that if we want to be serious about wielding power, about taking power and transforming the societies that we live in, we've got to be very serious about all of these things, about institution building, about being loyal to each other, about demonstrating competence, about actually kind of developing ourselves in a way that I think is alien to lots of people, maybe in my generation and of below, of reading books seriously, taking ideas kind of seriously, and taking, as trite as it sometimes sounds, taking each other seriously, being prepared to argue with each other and to decide that these people who are in the room with me are worth me sitting down and really trying to win over, and that they're never just kind of sheeple or idiots or conspiracy theorists, even though they are sometimes that. They're also the people that we need to, if we're going to have a chance of transforming society. So really, as I said in my speech, this is a question of courage. Do we have the courage to govern? And that's the question that populists need to answer.
Okay. Please give our panelists a round of applause. Before I do my concluding remarks, concluding thoughts, I'd like to invite Frank to come to the front, please. And would someone give him a microphone? Okay, great. Give us a few of your thoughts, Frank, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I have many thoughts. I was glad that John was here because he has got the moral opposite point of view to mine. I mean, when he talked about people being stupid, I asked myself how many Einsteins there are in the elites, because it seems to me that stupidity is something that is equally shared amongst all sections of society. And I think the reason why I took exception to that remark is because the one thing that we have to do is to learn from the people. We have to understand what their passions are, what they feel, what they really are all about, because at the moment we take people for granted. We assume we know them inside out. But actually, when people talk about the working class or working people, we forget the fact that it's not a homogeneous group that we're talking about, but we've got different layers with different possibilities. And at the moment in time, everything that's going to create a strong populist politics will come about from a dialogue that we engage with the people. It means taking the people seriously. I think that seems to me to be the most foundational element within populist politics. And to that extent, I think we have to be real. There's no point talking about we need a vision, because visions, unless you're a transcendentalist and believe that the vision will come to you in the middle of the night, it's not going to happen. Visions don't come by sitting around the table and working out plans. A vision comes from the interaction that you have within society. It emerges almost spontaneously within what is taking place within public life. And we have to learn to listen. All the successful populist parties, for example, there's somebody here from the Liga, come from the fact that you listen to what the people are saying. I've got a house in Lombardy in northern Italy, and I go around to the bars, and I go around and I talk to people. And when I tell them who I am, they call me El Professore. They're not interested in that. But when I tell them that I'm Hungarian, they say Orban. They really are interested in that. And what I really find that is so exciting is that the people in the area where I am are somehow are different than the people you meet in other parts of the world, because they've been listened to. And they know they got representatives that actually express and communicate what they are really all about. It's something that is very special, very rare within the European context. So the point I would want to emphasize is that this is something that we at the moment are not very good at. That contemptuous, paternalistic, patronizing attitude that exists within our public life often influences ourselves. We think that we know better almost kind of spontaneously than the rest of them do. And we've actually internalized all the prejudices that they have about the people as being stupid, as being unable to deal with complexity, unable to deal with different kind of issues. We need the experts to do that. I think that seems to me to be a big problem. I don't think there's any need to talk about anything to do with power unless we basically become a little bit more real and more modest. And the one issue that we haven't discussed, and we must have a discussion on this, is the fact that we really do need to win and genuinely intellectually win the younger generations. I think the schools are really where it's at. There's no point talking about the courts and changing the courts until the school system becomes fundamentally altered. If you have a child and you go to school in Belgium or in England or in France, I mean, it's unimaginable the crap that they are exposed to. It is really, truly staggering, the indoctrination and the prejudice that they often become subject to. There's no point in winning an election if that whole generation of people become estranged from you, a whole generation of people that you never touch and you don't influence. So it seems to me that it's the young generations that we need to engage with in a creative kind of a way. And if somebody talked about being sexy, unless young people think that our kind of alternative is really cool, and I hate using the word cool because when I say it as an old person, it does sound weird. Unless they really think that this is really, really cool, we are going to have a lot of problems in being able to engage and communicate with them. So to me, the future of politics lies in the way that a generational transaction and a generational dialogue can kick in and occur. Because it's only through solidifying the influence of some of the ideas that we talk about amongst the young that we can guarantee that whatever happens will have a foundation that is really, really solid, rather than the ephemeral way in which populism works at the moment. So I'm glad we've all been here and discussed. I go away, understandably, or not understandably, more ignorant, feeling more ignorant about what needs to be done than when I came. I think a lot of my certainties have been questioned. And I realized, and this is one of the tragedies of growing old, is the older you are, the more you realize just how ignorant you are.
Thank you for that, Frank. As we draw this conference to a close, let me begin by thanking all of you, speakers, panelists, participants, and those who've joined us online, for what has been a very rich and wide-ranging discussion. Over the course of the day, we've tackled some of the most urgent political questions facing Europe and the West. We've asked whether patriotic populism can offer a real alternative to an increasingly technocratic and distant political establishment. We've debated the meaning of patriotism in the 21st century, whether it can be reclaimed as a positive civic virtue or whether it risks tipping into division and exclusion. We have examined the uneasy relationship between populism and conservatism, a potential alliance grounded in shared concerns about tradition, sovereignty, and community, but also marked by real tensions in temperament, strategy, and worldview. And finally, we considered the most pressing challenge for any populist movement that claims to speak for the people. Can it actually wield power? Not just win elections, but govern effectively in the face of entrenched bureaucracies, hostile media, and international pressures. What today has made clear is that patriotic populism is not a monolith. It's a diverse, dynamic, and at times contradictory political force that we are still grappling with. But it is also a sign of something deeper. I would say a democratic hunger, a desire for belonging, a voice and accountability that cannot be easily dismissed. The task ahead, whether one supports or critiques populism, is to engage with it seriously. Not with fear or disdain, but with intellectual honesty and some political imagination. If we are, as Ivan Krastev has warned, at a moment of radical rupture, then those who care about democracy must be willing to ask the hard questions, not just about populism, but about the failings that gave rise to it. Thank you again for your thoughtful engagement throughout the day. We hope today's conversations have challenged you, provoked you, and above all, given you something to take away, reflect on, and continue to debate as you join us for a drink. Safe travels, and we look forward to seeing you at future events of MCC Brussels. Please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and please follow us on our website and get up to date on the upcoming events that we have. We've got some exciting things coming up. Thank you all very much.